Hi, I'm Michael. On behalf of my colleagues at the University of British Columbia, I'm excited to present our work titled Lies, Deceit, and Hallucinations, Player Perception and Expectations Regarding Trust and Deception in Games. To start off, lying, the act of making an untrue statement with the intent to deceive, has long been an important and debated topic within moral philosophy. Many academics have studied lying as a social interaction and its moral implications, but in general, lying has negative connotations because of how it can have harmful consequences that impact others. But what about in video games where the consequence of the lie never leaves the screen of the game? We find that characters that lie can add moral ambiguity, characterize the personas, add intrigue, and enhance metaphorical value of a game. This is particularly apparent through the interactions with the non-playable characters, or the NPCs, that add a lot to social interaction in games. Lying in games, at least to a human opponent, can be viewed at worst as a type of malicious cheating that compromises fairness. However, lying can also be a core part of the game itself. For example, in social deduction games like Avalon or Among Us, such games often require lying as part of the game mechanic. However, NPC interactions differ fundamentally from interactions with other humans, and there has been a trend for NPCs to more accurately model human behavior, including emotions, social relationships, and most relevantly, the ability to lie and deceive. Realistic NPCs are important because they impact the player's immersion in the game, and developing such NPCs is a popular topic within research. Most recently, such research has begun leveraging quite a new hot technology in the form of LLM-based models. However, one limitation of such models is their tendency to hallucinate, or to generate coherent-sounding outputs that are factually incorrect. So we start with our research questions, and we have a variety of questions that we aim to address through our study. To summarize them, they focus on how players gauge NPC truthfulness and develop trust, how they are affected when NPCs do make false statements and how they might attribute such statements, how such statements affect the player's subsequent gameplay and takeaways, and what are the implications of these prior research questions on overall game design. To address these questions, we performed a user study involving gameplay of a developed game along with a semi-structured interview. The purpose of the game was to serve as a gateway into further discussion into lies and deception in games. We'll discuss our game, AlphaBetaCity, and its unique features in the following few slides. AlphaBetaCity is an RPG set in an agrarian town. Players progress through the game through finishing quests, and there are 3 quests in the game. Firstly, an introductory quest. Players introduce themselves to every one of the townsfolk to get an initial impression of the characters and the town. Secondly, a fetch quest, in which players are to find one specific character. En route, players will have to talk to others and explore locations to progress. Lastly, a search quest, in which players are to find golden apples around town. NPCs provide hints that may or may not be reliable to the player in searching for these apples. The key feature of our game is that it has several false statements made by the NPCs. Not so many because it will make things very obvious, but they are sprinkled into the game at times. We vary them based on the dimensions of lies in past literature, as shown here. However, one thing that's quite important in the literature of lying is that of intention. If a scriptwriter makes a deliberate decision to write a false statement, then it's inevitably crafted with intent. But is there a way to craft such statements without human intent? The solution we decided for in this study is to remove the human entirely from some parts of the writing, and have parts be written by a large language model, an LLM. Within the game, such false statements generated by an LLM arise in the form of hallucinations. We used LLMs to aid in developing dialogue through prompting on the online ChatGPT platform. We noticed that in a very small number of instances, the LLM would hallucinate and say things that are wrong, and kept these in. For example, here the LLM mentions a clock tower that does not exist in the game. To induce hallucinations which occur rarely, we applied a liberal use of LLMs in script writing, though not in every dialogue, as quite a lot of the game was human written as well, as we wanted to have some false statements with human intention. We prompted the model with descriptions of characters and generated dialogue pertaining to quests, which we formatted and put into the game, as shown here. Our conversations with ChatGPT in generating the game, as well as an annotated script that points out where the various false statements are, can be found in the work's supplemental material. We delved into the user study with 29 participants with experiences in video games. Players are introduced to our game as one whose characters may or may not always be reliable, but we didn't tell them explicitly that it was about trust and deception, or that parts of the game were LLM generated. After playing the game, the topic of the study was introduced, and players answered questions relating to the game, its characters, and deceitful characters from their own gameplay experiences as well. After a set of questions, we revealed that aspects of the game were AI-written, which prompted further discussion. We highlight our analyzed findings in the next sections. To start off, we find that most players indicated a sense of instinctive initial trust towards the NPCs. However, several factors could affect initial expectations for trust. From the meta level, the genre of the game, the music, the ambiance, etc. From a more microscopic character level, their appearance, the context in which they are introduced, or established narrative conflict could be salient factors. For example, in our game, players often felt initial distrust towards a character named Hugh due to both narrative cues, but also his location in the game being more isolated, and the order characters are met in. Throughout the game, a player will interact with various NPCs. How can they gauge the verity of the statements being made? In some cases, it's obvious. Going back to the previous dialogue about the clock tower, the player can clearly see with their own eyes that there is no clock tower that exists. In other cases, though, verifying NPC statements is more ambiguous. For example, here, Candace talks about the smell of bread. Our game doesn't have smell, so how does the player gauge that to be more or less truthful? Players pointed towards the context of the setting, in this case also drawing from their own real-life experiences, but also discussed other factors that could point towards statements being more or less truthful, such as corroboration with other NPCs. Now, if a player believes a character to be saying things that might not be the most true, they might think, why? We identified a few points that characters attributed false statements to. Firstly, a game's narrative. False statements can drive conflict and characterization, often placing the character who made such a statement in an antagonistic spotlight, especially when it seemed like it had the intent to deceive. However, players also mentioned that some of the false statements seemed to be made without such intent, which made them seem like more realistic human flaws that can represent things like confusion or forgetfulness. From a gameplay design perspective, false statements can prolong a game by misleading the player to encourage them to explore or talk to other characters. Characters that make false statements also add an additional form of social challenge. Harking back to social deduction games, players might need to read into what people are saying and gauge who to trust, which adds a cognitive level of demand towards the game. Lastly, participant Sunshine mentioned that false statements could simply just be developer mistakes, such as bugs or typos. After we informed them that some parts were LLM generated, they also brought up that they could be hallucinations. Our findings reveal two main driving factors that affect the attribution of false statements, now that we know what they could be attributed to. Firstly, whether the player perceives the false statement to be intentionally included in the game, and secondly, whether the player perceives the statement to have the intent to deceive. A player's subjective perception of these aspects can be affected by several factors, such as the consequence, the effect of the false statement on their narrative and gameplay, to consistency, so how consistently that NPC made false statements. Related to that is the character itself. The player might have a preconceived mental model of the player's trust. And lastly, the perception of beliefs was another factor. Drawing from theory of mind, players may model what they think the NPC believes to be true. However, sometimes these factors might clash and be inconsistent in a way. Player expectations for an NPC and the NPC's behavior may mismatch. If this mismatch is too great, this might lead to player frustrations regarding the entire game. As a hypothetical, if a seemingly trustworthy NPC tells you one-off to go somewhere irrelevant and this had no effect on characterization or plot, players will definitely have valid reason to be annoyed. Participants indicate that they would expect the intentional use of false statements to have a purpose or a payoff, and if this resolution is not provided, the game can feel unfinished. However, participants also noted that the subtle, intentional weaving of such a trope could lead to an open-ended finale that's up to the player's own interpretation, balancing a fine line between a thought-provoking, reflective experience and a seemingly unresolved story. Nonetheless, we contrast the player desire for purpose and meaning against the lack thereof that LLMs provide. It's difficult to discuss the idea of intent in regards to LLM generation, but players discuss that knowing that parts of the game were LLM-written lifts any deeper meaning that they might have towards the game, and some would lower their overall threshold of trust towards the characters at the very start. The use of LLMs in games was largely criticized, one reason to their culpability to hallucinate without clear intent, another being that games lose their metaphorical artistry. We considered methods of addressing hallucinations if developers are intent on using them through error handling mechanisms and more extensive QA processes. We discussed the implications of our findings towards game design. False statements and deception can be used in games to help craft a complex narrative, often developing conflict or antagonism, humanize and create more realistic NPCs, adding a level of immersion, add a fun social obstacle that induces a balance of challenge and skill, and create confusion and bewilderment, leveraging player desires for meaning. However, game developers should consider how to balance the social challenge and not make it too cognitively overwhelming for the player, how players might perceive the false statements, and how they might attribute it. As shown, this affects how they feel towards the characters and possibly the perception of the overall game. And tied to this is the demographics of the target audience. There might be demographics of players that have more difficulty dealing with or discerning false statements in Deceit. Aspects such as age or developing for a neurodivergent population are just some examples of such factors to keep in mind. I want to discuss a final point on the meaning and artistry of games. We found that players attributed the literary element of deception towards a thematic meaning. When scriptwriters write false statements, they inevitably write it with some purpose that gives rise to some consequence. When an LLM does this, it's difficult to ascribe this purpose or intent. Nonetheless, players have a desire for definitive meaning. This forms a clear disparity between audience desire for meaning and the lack thereof in AI-created works. This is something to consider with the hastened use of AI in our modern age. It may be the case that people may hold desires for humanistic meaning, especially in artistic contexts, but that meaning may not exist, or its meaning might be more ambiguous when it's AI-generated. Humans may have to accept that there may not always be an objective meaning towards artistic works, but this could hark towards a future where people create their own subjective meaning of such works. For example, participants in our study were able to develop subjective, personalized meaning of what and why certain characters made false statements, which could be vastly different from the scriptwriter's initial intent. We consider ways for scriptwriters to actually communicate their intent to their gameplay audience. One example, for example, is through director commentaries or developer journals, which offer a direct line of communication. Thus, in conclusion, our work delves deeply into aspects regarding lying, deceit, and trust in the context of games. We highlight the full experience of how players gauge false statements and develop trust, how they perceive and attribute false statements, how the existence of such false statements affect the overarching experience within the game, and we propose some final considerations for future game designers regarding the use of false statements, but also LLMs in games. That concludes the presentation, and thanks for listening.